Which is fine because the next person that wonders about that will be the first. But what I do know is that if you like hash, you are going to love this. And to get started, let's go ahead and do a little dicing, which I'm going to demo on this potato. And what we'll do after we cut about a 1/4-inch slice off the bottom so it sits flat, is cut some more slices straight down, about the same width. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll slice these into sticks. And if we can stack a couple together to save time, all the better. And that's it. Once we have our sticks cut, we'll simply turn those and cut across to create a beautiful, hopefully uniform dice. And yes, whatever width we use for our slices and our sticks, that would be how big we're making each of these cross cuts. And I'm no geometrist, but that should get us something pretty close to a square cube. And not that it really matters, since this is going to become a hash, and you're really not going to be able to appreciate all this precision. But that's not the point. It's so they cook evenly, and we feel good about ourselves. And then once those are diced, we should probably keep them in some cold water so they don't turn brown before we need them. Whoops, come back here. And then once we have all our ingredients diced and or cubed, we can head to the stove, where we're going to melt some butter in some olive oil over high heat. And sometimes I use one or just the other. This time we're using both. And then once that melts, we'll go ahead and transfer in 1 pound of ground beef. Ideally from a grass-fed cow, since according to nature, that's what they're supposed to eat. And then what we'll do for the next 5 minutes or so is go ahead and break this up while it cooks with some type of flat edge utensil. And you can do that to any size you want, but I'm thinking something about the same size as our cubes of potato is not a bad idea. Speaking of which, once our ground beef looks a little something like this, we can go ahead and add our drained, already beautifully cut potatoes, along with a nice giant pinch of salt. And by the way, I did 2 large russet potatoes, which I think is a nice ratio for every pound of beef. And then what we'll do besides stirring all this together is reduce our heat to medium-high. And we will cook this stirring occasionally until our potatoes just start to soften up. And one great tip when you're making hash, whenever we're done stirring and tossing, we want to finish by smoothing and pressing, so we get as much of our product as possible pressed against the bottom of the pan, which is going to help everything get nice and crusty. And yes, now that the crumbling's done, I went ahead and switched to a more spoon-shaped spatula, which is going to work out better for the rest of the procedure. And then what we'll do once our potatoes do start to get tender, and how we know is of course we test them, is that we'll add the next wave of ingredients, which for me is going to be some diced onion and some mushroom. And we'll go ahead and stir those in. And we'll also give those a nice big pinch of salt. Right, when we're doing something like this and we're adding our ingredients in stages, it is not a bad idea to season as you go, versus trying to guess at the beginning or adjust at the end, which we're still going to do. But when we add something, let's go ahead and toss in a little bit of salt, right? Whatever amount we think necessary to season that amount of product. And then what we'll do is continue to cook this, stirring occasionally, until our onions and mushrooms have softened up and taken on some beautiful color. And again, every time we stir and toss, we're going to smooth and press. And of course, our beef and potatoes have continued to cook and crustify. And at pretty much any time during this process, we can go ahead and season this up any which way we want, which for me is going to be very simply with some freshly ground black pepper, a few 3 shakes of cayenne, and a little pinch of dried rosemary. And yes, of course you can use fresh. I just personally prefer the flavor of the dry here. And then once we feel like our onions and mushrooms have cooked long enough, we'll go ahead and add the next wave of ingredients, which for me is some diced red and green peppers. All right, red bell and poblano. And yes, you guessed it, we'll also add a pinch of salt. And we'll stir all that together. And basically, as soon as those peppers get tender, and we're happy with how dark and crusty the rest of our ingredients have gotten, we are pretty much done. So to recap, making a hash is basically a 3-step process. Right, the first phase is frying your meat and potatoes. And then the second phase would be adding ingredients like onions and mushrooms, or other vegetables that need a little longer to cook. And then the third and final stage would be to add the quick cooking vegetables like peppers, or anything else you find in your fridge. Right, in the game of hash, whoever adds the most ingredients wins. Okay, so before you put this together, feel free to take a look in the fridge, and maybe toss in some other things you have on hand. I mean, you are after all the Flash Gordon of your hash sorting, so I'm sure you'll figure that out. And that's it. Once we're extremely happy with how it looks and feels, and we've given it a taste and checked for seasoning, what we'll do is finish up with some freshly sliced green onions. And then once those are stirred in, we'll let this cook for another few minutes, or as long as we think it needs to go. At which point we can go ahead and pull it off the heat and serve it up. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to brown this as much as I like to. Alright, I like to go for severe crustification, which I believe improves the taste and the texture. But the one downside visually is that it does get very, very dark, which is why I'm going to have to insist you take a good look at it now in the pan. Since on the black background of the stove, you can actually see the true appearance pretty well. But as you'll see, once we pull this off and serve it up, and it's on a lighter background, it looks really, really dark. But all the same things that make this dark and maybe not so visually appealing are the exact same things that make it so incredibly delicious. So we make no apologies. Although to distract our guests a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and top this with a poached egg. And maybe the most perfect poached egg I've ever done. And then for some final touches, I did a shake of cayenne, plus a pinch of sliced green onions, which for the first time in 14 years of filming videos, actually landed exactly how I wanted them. And I really should have stopped at this point and ran out and bought a lottery ticket. But I didn't. I was afraid I would win. But anyway, I went ahead and grabbed a fork, and I busted that egg right in the yolk. And then, of course, I went ahead and took some contractually obligated pictures, like about 100, of which I'll use 1 or 2. But after that, I started eating. And that, my friends, is one of the most delicious hash experiences you'll ever enjoy. Okay, when you get such a deep dark browning on already savory things, like beef, onions, mushrooms, and peppers, all those rich, satisfying flavors get even more intense. And yes, it's sort of similar to a corned beef hash. But because we're using fresh beef instead of cured, it really is quite a different experience, and a wonderful one at that. Oh, and if you happen to be wondering, how would I turn this into cheeseburger hash? Well, that is a great question. And what you do is stir in a nice big handful of sharp cheddar, at the same point we stir in those green onions. So just something to keep in mind in case you're worried about not getting enough calories here. But whether you add cheese or not, or sneak in a few different vegetables, my end of the video call to action is going to be the same. Which is, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more